Welcome all. This is a discussion about science fiction film, Visions of the Future, which will be previewing an upcoming sequence by Graham School instructor Eva Fernandez. I am Seth Green, the Dean of the Graham School, and on an afternoon like this one, I am especially welcoming you to the University of Chicago. You can see us here in all of our glory. I will say that it is a gorgeous day, and so the campus actually looks as green and beautiful and as full of ideas as in this photo. For those of you who are not familiar with the Graham School, you should be. We are now 132 years into our mission of trailblazing new paths in lifelong learning. And what that literally looks like is that we have 4 program areas where learners from across the world can join us in the inquiry of the University of Chicago. We have a Master of Liberal Arts that is among the most respected and rigorous in the world, where you can look across the university's 4 divisions. We have a basic program where Eva Fernandez teaches, where we look across Western social and political thought and at what are often called the great books that frame our world and experience today. We have open enrollment, where you can explore across all of the disciplines of the university and typically have over 70 course offerings each quarter. And then we have annual programs that allow you to dive into a broad range of topics, from the future of museum publishing to better knowing your Chicago. But the reason that you are all here today is to learn from one of our greats, Eva Fernandez. She holds undergraduate and graduate degrees in English literature. She has been an instructor in the basic program since 1999 and has also taught at Kalamazoo, Denver Free University, and in other parts of the University of Chicago. The major focus of her graduate work at the university was late medieval literature, especially Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, in the context of classical and medieval philosophy. Other enthusiasms include classical literature, Old English poetry, 17th century English literature, 19th century American literature, 19th and 20th century philosophy, and modern and contemporary poetry. And as you'll hear, she also loves movies, especially horror and science fiction films, which, being a scaredy cat, I am glad we are on the science fiction side of that film interest. She also received the Graham School's Excellence in Teaching Award for the basic program in 2011. So she is accomplished, and we are very grateful to have her as part of our Graham community. And I'll start, Eva, by asking you about your decision to focus in on this content, because as I've just read, your background is in English literature. You have focused on political, historical, philosophical, as well as literary texts. And this coming academic year, you are going to be in a science fiction sequence. And so how did you come to science fiction movies as a focus?
Okay, yeah, thanks. Fair question. What the heck is up with that? Well, I'll tell you how I didn't come to it. I was never a fan of science fiction in written form. In fact, I can remember more than one person when I was in graduate school loaned me a copy of Neuromancer, insisting that I read it because it was the best thing ever. And I did try to read it at least a couple of times, but it just didn't take. So I did not, that's not the route. That's not how I got here. I got here, in fact, via horror movies, a deep love, an old love of mine. I think I initially thought of science fiction movies, like written science fiction, as a kind of cold. It didn't seem to, what goes on in those movies didn't seem to demand my attention by disturbing me. I didn't have a visceral reaction the way I do to horror movies. The horror movies tend to really grip me, and I feel like it's incumbent on me to do some thinking to figure out why I am so disturbed. Anyway, the more of these movies that I watched, though, the more I came to appreciate that science fiction, like horror, and maybe more obviously, science fiction fans among you are going to laugh at this, because in a way it's more obvious that the science fiction is really well suited to provoking philosophical reflection, or is really likely to make one do that kind of thinking. Nowadays, in fact, science fiction is usually classified as a subset of so-called speculative fiction, which tends to involve some kind of challenge to standard or typical ways of thinking. So in sci-fi, some unusual circumstance like a new technology or an alien invasion or a nuclear war or some other kind of catastrophe requires or invites a radical reconceptualization, usually by or often by defamiliarizing the familiar. For instance, I thought I knew what defines the human or what defines personhood. But now that there are these really advanced androids or these amazing creatures from another planet, I'm going to have to maybe revise my understanding of that. Or, I thought I had a pretty good grip on what constitutes reality. But if I think about time travel or wormholes or the possibility that I'm living in a computer-generated matrix, those kinds of thought experiment tend to shake up my common sense understanding. That kind of disorientation is often represented in the movie as something that the characters go through, but not necessarily. I think in disaster movies and in action movies generally, often the characters are they're busy reacting, right? They're not doing any thinking. They're busy reacting. I don't think Mad Max has a lot of deep thoughts, but even in those kind of movies, we as the audience can be provoked to think about things that aren't necessarily coming up for the characters. And in either case, that kind of disorientation or destabilization, making you question what you thought you knew at a really deep or fundamental level. So things that the kind of things that you've taken for granted and maybe built a whole lot of other thinking on, to find those destabilized is what I find really attractive about the genre, that it can do that. I mean, after all, that is what Socrates did, right? He questioned people in such a way that they reached a point, pushed them until they reached a point where they realized that some of their very basic concepts are either wrong-headed or maybe even incoherent, right? That didn't typically work out too well for him. Often people confronted by Socrates just balked and refused to think. But obviously, Plato is inviting us not to do that, right? To do the thinking that those interlocutors failed to do. All that aside, having said all of that, I also want to say that I really love sci-fi, again, like horror, for being so resolutely a popular genre, or maybe I should say usually. Some sci-fi films wear their pretensions on their sleeves. 2001 comes to mind, but many of them can be read perfectly straightforwardly as pure entertainment.
So before we jump into the philosophical connection, which I want to, can we just hear on the popular front, what's your favorite science fiction film and why?
Yeah. This is a hard question. I find it always very difficult to pick a favorite anything. Whenever I get asked this question, who's your favorite author, or who's your favorite thinker, or what's your favorite book, I freeze. I'm paralyzed. I'm paralyzed by the question. But that said, I think Blade Runner comes pretty quickly and easily, comfortably to mind for me. Not only for its really spectacular world building and cyberpunk style. That's a movie whose special effects and production design have held up remarkably well. I mean, really well, way better than lots of others, others even more recent. right? But especially I love Blade Runner because I think it's located on a really sweet spot on this spectrum between entertainment and serious thought, spectacle and speculation, let's say. It's full of action and intrigue, and it's amazing to look at. But it's also doing some pretty interesting thinking on the topic of personal as well as species identity. Not only what makes me human, but what makes me, or makes any of us particular people that we are. Is it our memories or personalities, whatever those are? Seem to be partly made of memories. Is it our, or is it something more like our self-awareness and our sense that we are fashioning a life? So it's that kind of question that I think Blade Runner is really good at provoking. In addition to some of the ethical questions that are raised by advances in artificial intelligence.
So I want to go deeper on the broader point you're making about the connection between science fiction film and philosophy. And your course is going to look at films across time. And so one of the interesting observations we were talking about in our preparatory conversation is that in some ways you can see how philosophical debates are taking place in a certain time period in science fiction that's taking place in that time period. And I'm curious if you can say a little bit more about that observation, and then maybe give us a couple of examples of how a film really shows a philosophical debate taking place meaningfully in the time in which it was created.
Okay. Yeah, I'm really glad that you have asked this question, because it's going to help me clarify something, I think. One species of use to which science fiction can be put is, broadly speaking, topical. Movies, like all works of art, are conditioned by the historical moments in which they're produced, and can also turn the lens on that moment in the kind of way you're suggesting, to critique or recast the way the issues are being framed, or maybe the way unthinking assumptions may be at work in the time period. So Metropolis, made in the early 20th century, obviously has something to say about class relations and industrial capital. And if we were going to be talking about that movie, we would want to try to think about what exactly it's saying, what it seems to be endorsing, what it maybe is critiquing, etc. Planet of the Apes. I think we could have a very interesting conversation about Planet of the Apes and vis-a-vis the way race relations were thought about in the 1960s in America. And I could say something similar about Stepford Wives and second wave feminism of the 1970s, or a number of recent movies that are taking up the topic of immigration, for example. So I would never want to discount that way of reading. I think it's perfectly legitimate, viable, and important and potentially fruitful way of thinking. But I do want to be, I do think that we should be careful about reading that way, because it can obscure some other things that may be going on and may be worth talking about. So I'm going to give let me try a more detailed example. Yeah. The alien invasion flicks of the 1950s are very often read as about the Red Scare in some way. The aliens are the communists who intend to take over the planet and destroy our American individualism and make us all slaves of the hive mind, right? Fair enough, right? Fair enough as far as it goes. It's certainly possible to read, for example, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, taking now a particular film, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, made in 1956 at the height of McCarthyism. It's possible to read that movie as a fairly straightforward right-wing anti-communist manifesto. But like any good text, it can be read in many ways. And I'm going to throw in here that that's one thing that's great about movies. One thing that movies, the movies really foreground is the limitation of reading for authorial intent. Because especially if you think that authorial intent is singular, it's like one thing or has to be consistent with itself, because movies are made by, have multiple authors, right? There's so many people involved in the making of movies, and they may have different intentions, which may show up in the product, right? In the work of art, they may be readable there. So going back to Body Snatchers, if you think about it as a representation of anxiety, as opposed to an expression of anxiety, then it looks less like a right-wing manifesto and more like a left-leaning critique of anti-communist hysteria of the period, right? And it also, arguably, I mean, it seems to, here's this kind of remainder after you have a coherent kind of self-consistent kind of reading. Often in texts, there's uncomfortable remainders, like, and do you just toss them out? Well, if you want to be really coherent, you do. But often the best stuff or the most interesting stuff is going on in that remainder. So one species of remainder in that movie is that it may be thinking, it seems to be doing some thinking not only about communism, but about the dehumanizing effect of conformism in the 1950s. So that would be just on a different topical track. I don't think you could get that to line up well with the way that it's engaging the issue of communist anxiety about communist infiltration. But, and here's the central point I'm trying to make here is that it's also possible to read in it some thinking that goes beyond the topical. If you read it not just as about American paranoia of the period, but as in part a reflection on what's at stake in or what's expressed in that kind of paranoia. For instance, the nightmare thought that the utterly familiar and mundane experiences that make up my life, and also the most intimate human connections in my life, could suddenly turn out to be not what I thought they were. That doesn't have anything to do with the 1950s, right? That's a much more general way of thinking, raises the specter of skepticism per se, right? How do I know I'm not misreading the empirical evidence? How do I know what even counts as empirical evidence? That the town in that movie has been taken over by the pod people, but it looks exactly the same as the town the protagonist grew up in. So it's a real shock when he realizes that something is terribly wrong. And I think that movie's really kind of centrally interested in skepticism, what's often called skepticism about other minds. How do I know that you're in there? How do I know that you're a human being? Is it something observable in you, or does it have more to do with my responses to you? So those are the kinds of thought that might be lost if we land too fast or too hard on more topical kinds of reading.
Well, so I just have a couple more questions, Eva, and then I want to invite those in the audience who have questions because we want to get to yours soon. I want to talk about how you approach this content from a thematic standpoint. And, I've seen the sequence, and so know that, over the 3 quarters, you're going to be focused on how science fiction looks at imagining the future, encountering the alien, and then versions of the human. And so I want to ask you about a bit about that architecture. What led you to kind of those categorizations thematically of different films, and what do each of those themes mean in your kind of snapshot perspective?
Oh, what they mean, I don't know, but I can tell, here's what I'll say. The division into those 3 parts is kind of pragmatic. There's certainly overlap. There are movies that could be moved from one list to another for sure. And a lot of the kinds of topic that are going to come up will be across the year, I think. Will show up across the year. But I do think that those three themes pick out some major types or categories of science fiction film. So that'll give each quarter sort of a different focus. Imagining the future. Fall quarter. Imagining the future is something that many science fiction films do in one way or another. It's the most common and in a way the most general of the three themes. That's why I thought we should consider it first, basically. And the hope is that the movies we talk about in that quarter will raise different kinds of question as a result of the different kinds of assumption that are being challenged. Encountering the alien, winter quarter, encountering the alien. It's not quite as common a theme, but it does, or it's a general, clearly, but it does carve out a huge subset. There's a lot of movies, right, about alien encounter, or at least involving alien encounter. So why? I mean, the question is, why is that trope so persistent or so useful? Unless it's a pretty mindless monster movie, which I love, by the way. I love mindless monster movies, but if it's not mindless, an encounter with the alien is one of the best ways to raise questions about our own species, including its place in the cosmos, its viability, and maybe even its definition. Which brings us to the third quarter, which I titled Versions of the Human in Defiance of Grammatical Regularity. Instead of a gerund, we've got a plural noun. Imagining the future and especially encountering the alien will have brought up, I think, the criteria of the human, what counts as a human being. But I wanted a third quarter to concentrate on movies that really foreground the interest by depicting various kinds of not quite human being, starting with Frankenstein's hodgepodge Revenant to various androids and other forms of artificial intelligence, and also some hybrids, human crossed with alien in Village of the Damned, crossed with insect in The Fly, crossed with machine in RoboCop, and then also some thought experiments involving transplanting a mind from one body into another or into multiple others in the case of clones. So all these liminal cases of the human, versions of the human, I think raise interesting questions about what we think is essential to human nature or to the individual person, what picks out a person.
Well, so I'm going to continue to ask questions, but I'm going to start engaging our chat because we've got a lot in there. Christopher Navratil asks, sounds fascinating. Within the 3.5 or 3.25 hour class, how do you anticipate balancing lecture and class discussion? Will there be some backup reading to go along with each film viewing? And so, you know, in short, what's on your syllabus and how will you approach teaching this content?
Okay, we're getting into the mechanics. It is a discussion-based course. That's really really important. So I'm glad you are asking that question. I, in fact, hope. So how will I balance? I'm not going to lecture. It's all discussion, and I hope that our focus is going to develop organically. This bears on the design of the course. I think that we may want to revise the way we think about that design. I think we'll probably be noticing all kinds of points of contact among the movies and identifying different sorts of interest or use or category. And in fact, I hope that we'll be refining our sense of what science fiction is as a genre as we make our way through.
And in terms of readings, how do those get paired with the movies or not at all?
No readings. My goodness, we're going to have our work cut out for us, right? We have 3 hours each week to talk about these movies. And in some cases, there will be 2 movies on the table. The second movie is always going to be secondary, right? There'll be a primary text. The movie is the text. That's why we don't need any other texts. We've got plenty. So yeah, the idea there is, and this is kind of, I'm going to kind of play with this in the first quarter. I think it's only 4 of the 10 weeks that I've paired, that I've thrown in another film. You know, you guys are going to tell me, you who take the class are going to tell me whether that's helpful or just too much material. But the idea is to look at the afterlife of some of these films, or in some cases, their forelife, movies that came before them. Not only in the franchises, I mean, obviously there's this phenomenon of sci-fi franchises where you've got sequels and prequels and remakes and etc. And sometimes they're doing very interestingly different things, especially in reboots. But sometimes will be the secondary film will be something that's more just maybe an homage in some way, or in a similar kind of territory of interest that might bear on how we might help us think about the primary film.
A related question before I move on to others, Philip Curley asked, will you be showing some clips from the movies as part of the discussions?
Yeah, thanks. Good, important question, because I really do hope that we will be thinking about filmic technique in part. We'll spend some time doing that. So for sure, to foreground that kind of consideration, I'll want to show short clips just to so that we can pay attention to the visual and sometimes auditory elements. You know, the like camera work and editing, right? That really it matters what the medium is. That kind of thing can we want to look at that to see how those things help the movies accomplish what they accomplish, or suggest what they suggest, how they function, how they work.
So there are some specific film questions here based on what you said in our conversation to date.
Sure.
Hansa, who is currently in Birmingham, Alabama, but mentions being a former San Francisco resident, which is relevant in the following sense, writes, I always thought of San Francisco as a character in Invasion of the Body Snatchers. So it's interesting to hear it describes the town in quotes. You want to just talk any more about how place shows up in the Body Snatchers?
See, I so wish that we were in the classroom and having a conversation so I could ask you a question, right? Right, so the question is, the town, is San Francisco, I mean, the question would be, it would depend what tack we're on, right? If we're trying to think about the possible critique or meditation on conformism, is that, San Francisco does not spring to mind as a hotbed of conformism to me. So that's really interesting, right? That's the kind of thing that, I hope people will bring up in class and say, wait a minute, it's really weird that, or do we think that it's San Francisco is standing in for every town the way London does in Things to Come. It's actually, there's an intertitle that says every town, but it's obviously London. So I don't know how to answer that question. I wish you were here so I could ask you.
So we will look forward to that dialogue in the class itself. AJW asks, what do you mean that 2001 wears its pretension on its sleeve?
I mean that it announces that it's a high concept movie. It does not look like popular entertainment. It announces that it's thinking big thoughts about evolution and the nature of time. And lots of sci-fi movies do that. I didn't mean to be disparaging. It might have sounded disparaging. I think there's again a kind of a spectrum, right? There are some movies that look like pure entertainment. There's some movies that are. There are stupid sci-fi movies for sure, but there are also some movies that look like pure entertainment that can be read for things going on in them that might not be obvious on first glance or something like that. And there are movies that, like 2001, that announce, heads up, I'm doing some serious thinking here. Pay attention. And then there's all kinds of stuff in between. That's basically what I meant by that.
We've got a few questions in the chat that relate to movies that exemplify the different themes that you mentioned earlier, Eva. And so maybe we can hear from you about a film that you feel like really embodies each of the themes and maybe a little bit about why. So this imagining the future theme that is going to be the arc of the autumn, is there a specific film that comes to mind that kind of tells the broader category story, so to speak?
No. It's a tough question, especially vis-a-vis the first quarter, because as I said, I was kind of aiming for variety, right? For different kinds of assumption to be destabilized. But if pressed, as an example, so choosing kind of at random, we could talk about Things to Come, weird movie made in 1936, which imagines way into the future and imagines, first of all, a 30-year global war, the consequences of which include environmental, medical, and socio-political disaster. Basically, the devolution, the collapse of civilization and the devolution of our world being the West, basically, in that movie. And then the advent of this organization called Wings Over the World, which is a group of former airmen who are also scientists and engineers who wrest control away from the feudal warlord played by Ralph Richardson in that movie, an absolutely stunning performance, amazing performance. So they take power away from him and return the world to a state of peace and order. So that can look like triumphalism, a species of triumphalism, right? Reason triumphing over the madness of war and the self-interest of individual people. But in fact, that solution looks kind of problematic, looks itself kind of problematic. It seems to involve totalitarian control and to result in a kind of sterility that it's hard to read as purely positive. So this is a good case in which authorial intent, no matter what the authorial intent, I mean, H.G. Wells seemed to take this totally straight. But no matter what his intention was, or even the intention of the director and other people involved in making the movie, it can raise questions for us about what we think really constitutes, how do we know what constitutes cultural and political progress? Maybe even what constitutes rationality, if this is supposed to be reason winning out, you know, rationality defined in what way? It doesn't matter how you define it. So that's an example.
Well, and can we take an example in the other thematic areas as well? So, I mean, as we think about encountering the alien, I realize, to your point, there are lots of different movies that have that idea. There are different meanings of alien in them. Is there one that I won't say represents the category, given your points in the first time, but is there one that comes to mind as particularly emblematic of the genre?
Sure. This case, I will choose less randomly and choose the one that's called Alien.
It does seem like on brand for that
category. Doesn't it? Right? That seems pretty straightforward. So the alien in that movie, the one made in 1979, the original Alien, is basically a big vicious bug that is maybe not quite mindless. I think it's kind of a question whether it has a mind, but it's at any rate very single-minded. The android Ash in that movie says, "I admire its purity. It has no, it's not burdened by conscience. Its only motive is survival." But in that movie, central to its survival is that it uses human beings as basically uteri or cocoons for its offspring. And we're going to think about that movie in tandem with Alien Resurrection, which is the fourth installment in the franchise, which is a complete mess. I think I'm the only person on the planet who likes that movie, but I really do like it. I like it a lot, in part because it's such a mess. For my money, it takes the core nightmares that are at work in Alien, the violation of bodily integrity and being reduced to a mere thing, mere biological tissue, which of course we are, among other things, that takes those kind of core nightmares to lurid and really interesting extremes. Do I say spoiler alert, or maybe I just leave it there so that there are no spoilers? But I encourage you to watch it, and maybe even watch it again. If you watched it and you thought, well, that doesn't know what it's doing, try it again. Try it again.
Well, so can we come into the last quarter and theme and hear about versions of the human?
Yeah. So again, lots of different kinds of version of the human that we're looking at, and some movies with this interest in the liminally human represent the not quite human as perfectly comfortable with its status, and maybe even hostile or indifferent to the human. One kind of classical example is AI that has moved beyond us, just leaves us behind, if not, seeks to destroy us, like in the Terminator movies, just has moved on, as in Her, the movie Her.
Yeah.
But a large subset of those movies about the liminally human, I think, are centrally concerned with or turn on what I would call the pathos of the liminally human, which sometimes involves its desire to be human. Data from Next Generation is a classic example that we won't be talking about. Frankenstein's creature is the progenitor of many of those beings, and we're going to start there. That's the first movie we're going to talk about. But from later movies, I'm going to say a little bit more about Blade Runner. The replicants, right, in Blade Runner have had human memories implanted in their programming, and have also come to develop some emotions and desires that are very near kin. That's why they've been given only a 4-year lifespan, because their developer knew that they might evolve. So they have, that's central to the, as I'm sure many of you know, right, central to the plot or the story is how difficult it is to tell, to distinguish between a replicant and a human being. And one of the desires that they have developed is the desire to live longer than their very limited lifespan. So they look very much like human beings. They are more human than human is the marketing tagline of the Tyrrell Corporation for these advanced robots. So the movie's pretty clearly asking us to think about what defines a human being, or putting it slightly differently. And this is really the core of the matter, I think, in this movie and in many. What makes any being worthy of the respect due to persons? Right? That's not really about species. If the concept of species has gotten expanded to such a point where you think, well, it's not our species. Like, these aliens are not our species, but are they due the respect that we think all persons deserve? Like right to life, right to self-determination. Many androids are developed as slave labor, as in Blade Runner. That's what the androids were for. That's why they're manufactured, to be slave labor. Right. So what is it that picks out persons who deserve freedom and justice and all the things that we think that should be due to persons? Right? Is it rationality? Was Aristotle right? It's or is it not reason but emotion, or empathy, which comes up in Blade Runner? Is it maybe empathy, or is it maybe, as I think Frankenstein already suggests, could it be something, a species of suffering? I would call it existential suffering. So that even the longing of some of these liminal creatures to the liminally human to be human may figure our longing for whatever it is we long for, meaning or enough time to carve out something meaningful. More than 4 years, please. So that's a
Yeah,
That's
a
my
great
best tip.
example. And it reminds me, coincidentally, to the point about interacting with philosophy, of discussions that I remember from being a college student. We had Peter Singer at our university, and he was raising a lot of these similar questions about what is it about the species? Is that a fair distinguishing line? How do we make moral choices in these other contexts? So many interactions with philosophy on a constant basis. We are coming up to time, and intentionally, I saved this last question from Sylvia Ansay to be our final one. She writes, what might I get out of the course if I've never before seen a sci-fi movie? And so I know that it may be a hard context for you to put yourself in as someone who is a very fluent sci-fi movie enthusiast, but what is your thought for Sylvia? How do you learn from this, even if you are not as familiar with the sci-fi genre?
Well, that's great. And I hope you do come on down, because it's always great to have a range of levels of familiarity with a kind of text and a kind of thinking. Well, I mean, first and foremost, I hope one thing you'll gain is a love of these movies, and that you'll go through an evolution, not like mine, unless you love horror movies, but that you'll come to appreciate the kind of value that this art form that is sometimes dismissed as mere entertainment really has, or can have, in some cases has. Yeah, and I think if I were to expand on that, I think it can help you think more about other popular forms that maybe shouldn't be dismissed.
Thank you, Eva. This has been a wide-ranging and fascinating conversation. I personally am eager to watch a number of movies you mentioned that I have not seen yet. There were several that you have that I have, and I fully concur with a lot of the ethical and broader philosophical questions that they raise, although I don't think I always understood them in the time. So we often talk about close reading of texts at Graham. I think that you are also going to help ensure that we are close viewers of film, and so that we're really able to dig in with rigor to everything we do as learners. Thank you all for joining us and for the great questions that you added into the chat to really energize our conversation. And for those of you who are so inclined, we'll make sure we get an email out with details on how you can be part of the dialogue version of this journey starting in the autumn. Have wonderful afternoons, everyone. And thank you again, Eva.
Thanks, everybody.